The morning fog hadn't yet been burned away by the sun when a rough hand closed around Samuel's thin arm. It was August 17th, 1898, on the Whitford plantation, 3 miles outside Montgomery, Alabama, where the cotton stretched thick and white as far as a child's eyes could see. The boy was 10 years old, maybe 60 pounds soaking wet, and he dragged his left foot when he walked. Born that way, his mama used to say, though she'd been sold off 2 years back, and her voice was something he could barely remember anymore. Thomas Whitford, owner of 200 acres and 43 souls, yanked Samuel across the dirt yard toward the cattle pen with a grip that left purple marks for days. The other enslaved workers froze mid-motion, hose suspended above the earth, because everyone knew what that pen meant. It meant Goliath. Inside that enclosure stood the massive Brahman bull like a mountain of muscle and fury, 800 kilograms of unpredictable rage that had already sent 2 white farmhands to the doctor with broken ribs and a shattered collarbone. Nobody went near that animal unless they had a death wish. Nobody except Samuel. But Whitford didn't know that yet. Small clouds of dust kicked up from the boy's feet as he tried to keep pace. He tried not to trip, tried not to cry out, even though his bad foot screamed with every uneven step. The morning air smelled of manure and fear, thick enough to taste. Samuel could hear the bull before he saw him. That deep, rumbling breath that sounded like distant thunder, the scrape of hooves against packed earth. His heart hammered against his ribs as if trying to escape his chest. From the fields, from the barn door, from anywhere they could watch without being seen, other enslaved people looked on. This was how plantations across the South operated in 1898. Punishment became spectacle, terror became a lesson. One child's suffering became everyone's warning. Leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed, the overseer, a red-faced man named Polk, had tobacco juice dark in the corner of his mouth. He'd seen this before, they all had. Different child, different day, the same cruel algebra of power. Before we go on with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Stories like this must never be forgotten. Let's continue. Montgomery, Alabama, in the summer of 1898, existed in a particular kind of hell. Reconstruction had died 20 years earlier, and the Jim Crow laws had settled over the South like a suffocating blanket. Black codes restricted every aspect of life for African Americans, whether enslaved in practice or technically free in name. The Whitford plantation operated in that gray space where the law said one thing, but reality practiced another. At 46 years old, Thomas Whitford was a second-generation landowner who had inherited both property and philosophy from his father. He believed in discipline above all else, in breaking spirits before they could bend toward resistance. His wife had left him 3 years prior, taking their only daughter back to her family in Georgia, unable to stomach what she'd seen in the cattle pen one too many times. Now Whitford lived alone in the big house with his bourbon and his certainties, convinced that fear was the only language worth speaking. Samuel had arrived at the plantation when he was 7, part of a group of 12 purchased at auction in Mobile. His deformed foot made him nearly worthless in the cotton fields where speed mattered, where falling behind meant the whip. So he'd been assigned odd jobs feeding chickens, collecting eggs, mucking stalls, tasks that kept him near the animals and away from the other workers. The isolation wasn't accidental. In the brutal mathematics of plantation labor, weakness was contagious. The other enslaved people, already pushed to the edge of human endurance, couldn't afford to be associated with someone who might slow down their row, might draw the overseer's attention, might get them all punished when quotas weren't met. So Samuel ate alone, slept alone in the corner of the barn, and spoke mainly to creatures that couldn't speak back. That's how he'd met Goliath. The bull had been brought to the farm 6 months earlier, purchased from a breeder in Texas who specialized in Brahman cattle. These animals, originally from India and adapted to brutal heat, had only been introduced to the American South in the previous decades. They were prized for their resistance to disease and their ability to survive on poor grazing land. But they were also known for their temperament, proud, stubborn, and fiercely defensive of their space. Goliath embodied all of these traits magnified. He stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, his hump pronounced, his horns swept back like scimitars. His hide was a dusty gray that seemed to shimmer silver in certain light. The first week he arrived, he'd charged the fence so hard he'd split a railroad tie. Whitford had laughed at that, seeing it as proof of the animal's strength. But when Goliath put John Hadley in the hospital, the laughter stopped. Almost by accident, Samuel had started feeding the bull. He'd been tasked with clearing out spoiled corn from the storage shed, and rather than carry it all the way to the compost, he dumped it near the cattle pen. Goliath had watched him with those dark, measuring eyes, then slowly approached the fence. The boy had frozen, expecting a charge, expecting those horns to splinter the wood. Instead, the bull had simply begun eating, his massive jaw working methodically. The next day, Samuel had brought fresh corn and some green leaves he'd pulled from the edge of the cotton field. He'd set them down and backed away slowly, never making direct eye contact, never moving too fast. Before she'd been sold, his mommy had told him that animals could smell fear the same as they could smell food. So he tried to smell like neither. He tried to smell like nothing. Over the weeks, something shifted. Samuel began talking to the bull in the same quiet, steady voice he used when he was alone in the barn at night, telling himself stories to keep the dark at bay. He told Goliath about his mama, about the songs she used to sing, about the one time she'd stolen a piece of honey candy and split it with him behind the smokehouse. He told the bull about his foot, how it ached when the weather changed, how the other children used to mock the way he walked before they stopped talking to him altogether. Goliath would stand there chewing, breathing, occasionally flicking an ear toward the sound, and slowly, so slowly that Samuel couldn't pinpoint when it happened, the bull began to let him closer, first to the fence, then to the gate. Then one morning when the sun was just breaking and no one else was awake, Samuel had climbed over the fence and stood in the pen, his heart in his throat, and Goliath had walked over and let the boy rest his hand on that thick, warm neck. Those stolen early mornings became a routine. Samuel would slip out before dawn when Poke was still sleeping off his whiskey, and Whitford was still lost in whatever dreams tormented men like him. He'd bring whatever food he could scrounge, corn husks, apple cores, wilted lettuce, and he'd spend half an hour just standing there with his hand on the bull's shoulder, feeling that immense, steady breathing. It was the only peace he knew, the only relationship in his life not built on fear or hierarchy or the constant calculation of survival. Goliath never judged his limp, never measured his worth in pounds of cotton picked, never looked at him like he was a problem to be managed. The bull just existed, solid and real, and for those 30 minutes each morning, Samuel got to exist too, not as a slave or a burden, but as a boy who had a friend. He'd named the bull himself, though he never spoke the name out loud except in whispers. Goliath, like the giant from the Bible stories the old woman on the next plantation over used to tell. But in Samuel's version, Goliath wasn't the villain. Goliath was the one who stood up when everyone else cowered. Goliath was strength that couldn't be taken away, but secrets on a plantation were like water in a cracked cup. They never stayed contained for long. Someone saw him near the pen. Someone mentioned it to someone else. And that someone happened to be within earshot when Whitford was in one of his moods, the kind where he needed to prove something to himself, needed to remind everyone who held the power. That's how Samuel ended up in that iron grip on that August morning, being dragged toward the one place on the whole plantation that everyone else avoided. Whitford hauled the boy to the pen and shoved him forward so hard that Samuel fell, his palms scraping against the rough wood of the gate. The man's voice came from above and behind, thick with bourbon from the night before and something meaner than anger. "You've been sneaking around my bull, boy, that true?" Samuel's throat closed up. He couldn't speak, couldn't even shake his head. Terror had turned his tongue to stone. Answer me when I'm talking to you." Whitford's boot connected with Samuel's ribs, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to knock the wind out of him. The boy gasped, tears springing to his eyes, and managed to nod. "Thought so." Whitford reached down and grabbed him by the back of his threadbare shirt, hauling him upright. "See, I got a theory about boys who don't listen, boys who think they're special, boys who need to learn their place." He dragged Samuel to the gate and started working the latch. "You like that bull so much. Let's see how he likes you when you ain't bringing food. Let's see if he's as friendly when you smell like fear instead of corn." The other workers had stopped pretending not to watch. A woman named Essie, who sometimes gave Samuel an extra biscuit when no one was looking, had her hand over her mouth. Big Marcus, the strongest man on the plantation, stood with his shoulders hunched like he was bracing for a blow. They all knew what was about to happen. They'd all seen the aftermath of Goliath's rage, and they all knew there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. Whitford swung the gate open. The hinges screamed like something dying. Goliath stood in the center of the pen, his head raised, his nostrils flaring. He'd been eating from a pile of hay, but now his attention had shifted completely to the gate, to the man, to the boy. The bull's tail switched once, twice. His front hoof pawed at the dirt, leaving a deep gouge. "Go on," Whitford said, shoving Samuel forward again. "Go meet your friend." Samuel stumbled into the pen. Behind him, the gate slammed shut with a sound like a coffin closing. The world shrank to this circle of dirt, this 800-kilogram animal, this moment where life hung thinner than spider silk. The boy's bad foot gave out and he fell hard, landing on his side, the air driven from his lungs for the second time in as many minutes. He tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't obey the frantic commands his brain was screaming. All he could do was look up, and what he saw was Goliath moving. The bull's hooves struck the ground like drums, 3 massive steps that closed the distance between them faster than Samuel's terror-frozen mind could process. "He's going to kill me," the boy thought with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in the instant before disaster. "He's going to trample me and gore me, and there won't even be enough left to bury." He squeezed his eyes shut, unable even to raise his arms in defense, unable to do anything but wait for the impact. But the impact didn't come. Instead, he felt heat, body heat, massive and overwhelming, and breath that smelled like grass and earth. Samuel opened his eyes and realized that Goliath was standing over him, the bull's huge head lowered, positioned between the boy and the gate, between the boy and Whitford. The animal's sides heaved with each breath, muscles twitching beneath that gray hide. But he wasn't attacking. He was shielding. Outside the pen, the world had gone silent. Even the cicadas seemed to have stopped their endless singing. Whitford stood with his hands still on the gate, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. Poke had straightened up from his fence post, his mouth hanging open. The enslaved workers stood frozen, witnesses to something that shouldn't be possible, something that violated every law of nature and power they'd been taught to believe in. Goliath turned his head slowly, deliberately, until he was looking directly at Whitford. The bull's dark eyes held no rage, no panic, just a flat, measuring assessment that seemed more human than animal. Then he lowered his head slightly and took one step forward, just one, but it was enough. It was a statement written in muscle and weight and undeniable presence. The statement said, "No further." Whitford's face had gone pale beneath its permanent sunburn. His hand slipped from the gate. He opened his mouth twice before any words came out, and when they did, they came out wrong, uncertain, stripped of their usual command. That ain't natural." No one answered him. No one moved. Still on the ground beneath the bull's protective stance, Samuel felt tears running down his face. But they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were something else, something bigger and more complicated than his 10-year-old mind had words for. Relief, maybe, or recognition, or the soul. Deep understanding that in a world designed to crush him, something had chosen to stand. Goliath remained motionless, his breathing steady, his position unchanged. Through the ground, Samuel could feel the vibration of that breathing, could smell the particular scent of the bull's hide, could see every detail of those powerful legs planted like oak trees on either side of him, and he understood in that moment that this wasn't magic. This wasn't divine intervention or supernatural blessing. This was simply what happened when you treated another living thing with consistent kindness, when you spoke gently instead of harshly, when you offered food and presence and respect instead of violence and fear. This was what happened when love, however small and strange and unlikely, was given room to grow. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning in that suspended moment. Finally, Whitford stepped back from the gate. Then another step. Then he turned and walked away, his boots kicking up dust, his shoulders held too straight, like a man trying to convince himself he'd meant to retreat all along. Poke hesitated, looked at Samuel, looked at the bull, then followed his boss back toward the big house. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd of witnesses dispersed, each of them carrying away the story of what they'd seen, knowing it would spread, knowing it would grow with each retelling. Only Essie remained, standing by the fence with her hand still pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her weathered face. She caught Samuel's eye and nodded once, a gesture that contained multitudes. Then she too turned and walked away, leaving the boy alone with his unlikely protector. Samuel lay there a while longer, not quite ready to move, not quite ready to break whatever spell had settled over the pen. Eventually, slowly, he pushed himself up to sitting. His ribs ached where Whitford had kicked him. His palms were scraped raw. His bad foot throbbed with a deep, familiar pain. But he was alive, he was whole, and standing above him, still alert, still watchful, was Goliath. Tentatively, the boy reached up and placed his hand on the bull's leg. The hide was warm and rough beneath his palm, real as anything he'd ever touched. Goliath's ear flicked toward him, acknowledging the contact. Then, with a low sound that might have been satisfaction, the bull shifted his weight and lowered himself carefully to the ground beside Samuel, folding those massive legs beneath him like he was settling in for a long stay. Samuel leaned against that warm, solid flank and let himself breathe, really breathe, for what felt like the first time in years. Above them, the sun finally burned through the morning fog, turning the Alabama sky from gray to gold. In the distance, someone called out instructions for the day's work. Life on the plantation continued its brutal rhythm, unchanged by what had happened in this small circle of dirt. But for Samuel, everything had changed. The walls of his loneliness had cracked wide open, and through that crack had come the most improbable gift, the knowledge that he wasn't alone, that he mattered to someone, even if that someone had 4 legs and horns and weighed as much as 10 men. He stayed there until the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive. When he finally stood, using Goliath's shoulder to steady himself, the bull rose too, shaking his head once as if to clear it. Samuel limped to the gate and let himself out, closing it carefully behind him. As he walked back toward the barn, he could feel eyes on him from every direction, some curious, some frightened, some calculating what this new development might mean for the careful balance of power on the plantation. He kept his head down and his pace steady, the way he'd learned to survive. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. The days that followed moved with a strange new rhythm, as if the plantation had tilted slightly on its axis, and everyone was still learning how to walk on the changed ground. Whitford didn't come near the cattle pen, he didn't call for Samuel, didn't acknowledge his existence at all, which was its own kind of miracle. The overseer Poke watched the boy with narrowed eyes whenever their paths crossed, but he kept his distance too, his hand never reaching for the whip that hung at his belt. It was as if Samuel had been wrapped in some invisible protection, and everyone could see it except they couldn't explain it, couldn't name it, couldn't quite believe it was real. But the other enslaved workers noticed. They noticed everything. Big Marcus was the first to approach him directly. It happened 3 days after the incident, when Samuel was hauling water from the well to the chicken coops. Marcus stood 6'4" and had arms like tree trunks from 20 years of swinging a cotton hook. He'd never spoken to Samuel before, had barely looked at him. Now he stood in the boy's path, blocking the sun, his shadow falling across Samuel like a question. "That bull," Marcus said, his voice low and careful, "he really let you touch him?" Samuel nodded, the bucket handle cutting into his palms. "And he stood between you and the boss man, wouldn't let him near you." Another nod. Samuel's throat felt tight. He wasn't used to being addressed, wasn't used to being seen. For a long moment Marcus studied him, his face unreadable. Then something softened in his expression, just slightly. "My daughter," he said quietly, "she's about your age, lives over on the Harrison place since they split up families last year. Poke's been bothering her. You understand what I'm saying?" Samuel understood. Everyone understood, even the children, especially the children. "I was wondering." Marcus continued, each word chosen carefully, weighed and measured. "If maybe you could talk to that bull, see if he'd let her come visit. Just visit, mind you. Stand near the pen where folks could see, where Poke could see." He paused. Might be that if Poke thinks the bull's watching, he'd think twice. It was the first time in Samuel's life that someone had asked him for help. The first time his existence had been framed as something other than burden or inconvenience. He looked up at Marcus, at this man who could snap him in half without effort, but who stood there with something like hope in his eyes. And Samuel felt the weight of it settle onto his thin shoulders. "I can ask," Samuel said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Can't promise nothing, but I can ask." Marcus's face didn't change, but his hand came down briefly on Samuel's shoulder, squeezed once, then released. "That's all anybody can do," he said. Then he walked away, leaving Samuel standing there with his bucket of water, and a responsibility he'd never imagined carrying. By the end of the week, 3 more people had approached him with similar requests. Essie wanted protection for her grandson, who'd been threatened with sale if he didn't pick faster. An old man named Joseph asked if the bull's presence might stop the overseer from entering the women's quarters at night. A young woman, barely older than a girl herself, whispered that her husband had been beaten so badly he couldn't work. And could Samuel maybe, possibly, ask if the bull might stand nearby when the work assignments were given out, just to remind Whitford that some things shouldn't be done. Samuel didn't know how to carry all these hopes. His shoulders weren't built for it. His 10-year-old mind couldn't process the complexity of what was happening, how his unlikely friendship with an animal had somehow transformed him into a symbol, a talisman, a fragile thread of resistance in a place where resistance usually meant death. But he tried. He tried because no one had ever needed him before, and the feeling of being needed was both terrifying and intoxicating. He brought Goliath extra food, saved from his own meager portions. He spent longer in the pen each morning, talking to the bull in that steady voice, explaining things he only half understood himself. And somehow, impossibly, Goliath seemed to understand. When Marcus's daughter visited one Sunday, standing nervous and small outside the pen, the bull positioned himself at the fence closest to her, massive and undeniable. When Poke walked by, his eyes calculating, Goliath's head swung toward him, and the overseer suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The transformation in how people treated Samuel was subtle but unmistakable. As he started leaving extra food near his sleeping spot in the barn, a biscuit here, some dried meat there, always placed where it could be found but never acknowledged. Marcus taught him how to tie proper knots when they were both working near the storage shed, passing along knowledge that might save his life someday. The old man, Joseph, who knew stories going back 3 generations, started including Samuel when he told tales after dark, giving the boy a history he'd never had access to before. But it wasn't all kindness. Some of the younger men resented him, saw him as getting special treatment, as benefiting from something he didn't earn. A field hand named Tobias, bitter from years of brutal labor, spat near Samuel's feet one evening and muttered something about boy playing master that made Samuel's face burn with shame. And there were those who were simply afraid that Samuel's protection would run out, afraid that Whitford's restraint would snap, afraid that they'd all pay the price for this temporary upset. In the natural order of things, they weren't wrong to be afraid. Samuel could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. that sense of borrowed time running out. Whitford had backed down once, but men like Whitford didn't stay backed down. They stewed and plotted and waited for their moment to reassert dominance. It was only a matter of when, not if. The moment came on a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks after the incident in the pen. The cotton harvest was in full swing, which meant longer hours, shorter tempers, and quotas that climbed higher every day. Everyone was exhausted, running on too little sleep and too little food, their hands bleeding from the sharp balls, their backs screaming from the endless bending and picking and hauling. Samuel had been assigned to help with the cotton press, a job that didn't require speed but did require strength he barely had. He was struggling with a lever, trying to compress a bale, when his bad foot slipped on some loose cotton and he went down hard, pulling the lever with him. The mechanism shrieked and jammed, grinding to a halt with a sound like breaking bones. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Poke appeared within seconds, his face purple with rage. "What the hell did you do?" Samuel tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't work. The press was vital to the operation. Without it, the cotton couldn't be properly baled, couldn't be loaded, couldn't be sold. He'd just cost Whitford time and money, two things the man valued more than human life. "Get up," Poke snarled. And when Samuel couldn't move fast enough, the overseer's boot caught him in the stomach. The boy curled around the pane, gasping, and dimly heard Poke shouting for someone to fetch Whitford, telling him what the useless boy had done now. Whitford arrived carrying a riding crop. From his position on the ground, Samuel saw it and knew with absolute certainty that whatever protection Goliath had provided was about to be tested in the worst possible way. Because the bull was a quarter-mile away in his pen, and Samuel was here, and there was no one to stand between him and what was coming. 6 weeks, Whitford said, his voice eerily calm. 6 weeks you've been walking around like you own the place, like you're something special. He flexed the crop, the leather making a soft whispering sound. Time somebody reminded you what you actually are. The first strike caught Samuel across the shoulders, the second across his back. The third hit his legs, the bad one, and he heard himself cry out before he could stop it. Whitford was methodical, spacing the blows, making each one count. Not enough to permanently damage. Damaged goods were less valuable, but enough to hurt, enough to humiliate, enough to re-establish the hierarchy that had been temporarily disrupted. The other workers watched because they had to, because looking away would be noted, would be punished. Essie had tears streaming down her face. Marcus's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his whole body trembling with the effort of staying still. Through the haze of pain, Samuel realized this was the lesson not just for him, but for all of them. This was Whitford reminding everyone that the incident in the pen had been an aberration, a fluke, and that the real power structure remained unchanged. 7 strikes, 8, 9. Samuel lost count after that. Lost everything except the burning lines of fire across his body, the taste of dirt in his mouth, and the small, desperate wish that someone would make it stop. Someone did. The sound came first, hooves on packed earth moving fast, then shouting, confusion, the scattered scramble of people getting out of the way. Samuel couldn't lift his head, couldn't see, could only hear and feel. He felt the vibration through the ground, felt that familiar rhythm he'd come to know so well. And then he felt breath on his face, hot and real, and smelled grass and earth, and knew without looking that Goliath was there. The bull had broken out. Somehow, impossibly, the animal had broken through the gate of his pen and covered the quarter-mile between them at a full charge. He stood over Samuel now, his sides heaving, his head lowered in a way that was unmistakably aggressive. Whitford had stumbled backward, the crop falling from his hand. Poke had gone pale as death. The whole plantation seemed to hold its breath. "Get that animal back in his pen," Whitford said, but his voice cracked on the words. No one moved. No one was stupid enough to try. Goliath took a step toward Whitford, just one step, but it was enough to send the man scrambling back another 3 paces. The bull's message was clear. You don't touch him, not while I'm here, not ever. For a long moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. This was where it could all end, where Whitford could order the bull shot, where he could have Samuel killed for witchcraft or devil worship, or any of the dozen justifications men like him used when they wanted to destroy something they couldn't control. The boy waited for that inevitable conclusion, his body too hurt to care anymore, his mind too tired to be afraid. But Whitford surprised him. Instead of escalating, instead of reaching for a gun or calling for help, the man just stood there breathing hard, staring at the bull and the boy beneath it. Something moved across his face, not quite fear, not quite respect, but some complicated mixture of both. He'd been challenged twice now, humiliated in front of his workers, and some part of him seemed to recognize that pushing further would only deepen that humiliation. "Fine," Whitford said finally, the word bitter as medicine. "He wants to play nursemaid to A. Let him." He turned to Poke. "Get that press fixed, everyone else back to work, and you," he pointed at Samuel without looking directly at him, "you stay away from equipment you can't handle, stick to feeding animals since that's all you're good for." It was a retreat disguised as an order, a way to save face while still backing down. Whitford stalked off toward the big house, his shoulders rigid, leaving Poke to manage the situation. The overseer looked at Goliath, looked at Samuel, and seemed to come to some internal calculation. He nodded slowly, like he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. "Get him to the barn," Poke said to no one in particular. "Clean him up, and somebody fix that damn gate before that bull decides to go wandering again." Hands reached for Samuel, gentle hands this time, careful of his injuries. Marcus and another man named Daniel lifted him between them, supporting his weight as they carried him away from the press, away from the cotton and the bloods, battered dirt. Goliath followed, his pace matching theirs, his head still lowered and watchful. They made a strange procession across the plantation yard. 2 men, 1 boy, 1 bull, all of them moving together in a silence that felt both sacred and surreal. They settled Samuel in the barn on a pile of relatively clean straw. Essie appeared with water and clean rags, along with a tin of salve that smelled like herbs and pig fat. As she cleaned his wounds with hands that had tended countless injuries over countless years, Samuel watched Goliath position himself at the barn entrance, blocking the doorway with his bulk. The bull wasn't leaving, wasn't even considering it. "That animal loves you," Essie said quietly, wringing out a blood-stained rag. "Don't know how, don't know why, but that's what this is, love." Samuel didn't answer. He was thinking about what love meant in a place like this, where it was weaponized and withheld, used as leash and lure and lie. But what he felt when he looked at Goliath wasn't complicated like that. It was simple, pure, the kind of thing that existed before humans made it twisted. The word spread fast. By evening, everyone on the plantation knew that the bull had broken out of his pen to protect Samuel. By the next morning, people on neighboring farms had heard. By the end of the week, the story had reached Montgomery itself, growing with each telling until it was less fact and more legend. Some versions said Samuel could control animals with his mind. Others claimed he'd made a deal with dark forces. A few whispered that he was marked by God, chosen for some greater purpose. Samuel knew the truth was simpler and stranger. He'd shown kindness to a creature everyone else feared, and that creature had remembered. That was all. That was everything. But simple truths have a way of becoming complicated when other people get involved. The attention made him visible in ways he'd never been before, and visibility on a plantation was rarely safe. Some of the enslaved workers started treating him like a talisman, believing his presence could ward off evil or bring luck. Others resented the attention he drew, worried it would bring more scrutiny down on all of them. And Whitford, though he kept his distance, watched Samuel with eyes that calculated and measured, trying to find an angle, trying to figure out how to turn this situation to his advantage. The plantation owner's opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. A man named Hiram Jessup rode up to the big house one October afternoon on a horse that cost more than most people's lives. Jessup was a dealer, a broker, a man who made his living buying and selling human beings and agricultural equipment with equal dispassion. He'd heard rumors about the boy and the bull, and rumors in his business were valuable. Curiosities sold for premium prices, especially to the growing number of traveling shows that were beginning to crisscross the South. Samuel knew none of this when Whitford called him to the house. He only knew that being summoned was never good, that the big house meant trouble, that every step toward its wide porch felt like walking toward his own grave. Goliath tried to follow, but Poke and 3 other men had managed to herd the bull back into his pen, reinforced now with extra boards and a new lock, before Samuel even knew what was happening. Whitford sat on his porch in a rocking chair, Jessup beside him in another. Both men held glasses of amber liquid that caught the afternoon sun. They watched Samuel approach with the kind of attention people give to livestock at auction, assessing weight and health and potential profit. "Show him," Whitford said without preamble. "Sir," Samuel's voice came out small, "the bull. Show Mr. Jessup what you do with the bull." Samuel felt his stomach drop. This wasn't punishment. This was worse. This was performance, demonstration, proof of value, and he understood with sickening clarity what it meant. Whitford was going to sell him and Goliath together, package them as a matched set, a traveling curiosity for whatever buyer paid the highest price. "I don't do nothing special," Samuel said carefully. "I just talk to him is all. Feed him, he's just a bull. Don't lie to me, boy." Whitford's voice had an edge now. "I've seen what that animal does for you. Everyone's seen it. Now you're going to show Mr. Jessup, or I'm going to have Poke beat you while the bull watches, and we'll see if that animal's loyalty holds when you're screaming." It wasn't an idle threat. Samuel could see it in Whitford's face, in the way Jessup leaned forward with interest rather than horror. These men didn't see cruelty. They saw demonstration, proof of concept, a way to verify the merchandise before purchase. Samuel's mind raced. If he refused, he'd be beaten, and Goliath would be driven mad watching it happen. If he complied, he'd be confirming his own value as a commodity, sealing both their fates. There was no good choice, no clever way out. There was only damage control. "I'll show you," Samuel said quietly, "but not with whips or beating. That ain't how it works." Jessup smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Smart boy knows how to preserve the goods." He stood, brushing dust from his expensive pants. "Lead the way." They walked to the cattle pen, Samuel, Whitford, Jessup, and Poke trailing behind like a shadow. Other workers had stopped what they were doing, sensing something significant happening. As he stood by the cotton press, her hand over her heart, Marcus had his daughter beside him now, the girl having been brought over for a visit, and he pulled her closer as he watched. Samuel reached the pen and stopped. Goliath stood in the center, his head raised, his eyes fixed on the boy. The bull could sense the tension, could read the fear that Samuel couldn't quite hide. For a moment, Samuel considered just walking away, letting whatever happen happen. But then he thought about what would come after the beating, the torture, the escalation. And he thought about all the people who'd started to depend on him, who'd begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely powerless. He opened the gate and walked in. Goliath moved immediately, crossing the pen in 3 powerful strides. But instead of standing over Samuel like before, the bull positioned himself between the boy and the fence between Samuel and the watching men. It was the same protective stance from that first day, the same unmistakable statement, "No further, call him off," Jessup said. "Show me you can control him." Control. The word tasted like metal in Samuel's mouth. He didn't control Goliath. That was the whole point. What they had wasn't dominance and submission. It was trust, respect, something that couldn't be bought or sold or demonstrated on command. But he had to try. "Goliath," Samuel said softly, using the name out loud for the first time in front of others. "It's okay, I'm okay." The bull's ear flicked toward him, acknowledging the sound, but he didn't move. "Come here, Goliath, please." Slowly, with visible reluctance, the bull turned. He walked to where Samuel stood and lowered his head, letting the boy's hand rest between his horns. The touch was familiar. steadying, a reminder of all those early mornings when it had been just the two of them, and the world hadn't yet woken up to complicate things. "Touch him," Jessup said to Whitford. "See if the protection holds when someone else tries." Samuel's hand tightened in Goliath's hide. This was the test, the moment that would determine everything. If Goliath let Whitford approach, the demonstration was complete, the sale confirmed. If he didn't, Whitford climbed the fence and dropped into the pen. He moved slowly, his eyes never leaving the bull, his body tense and ready to scramble back if needed. He got within 10 feet before Goliath's head came up, a low rumble building in the animal's chest. 5 feet, and the bull took a step toward him, ears pinned back. Whitford froze, then retreated carefully, climbing back over the fence with as much dignity as he could manage. "Interesting," Jessup said, stroking his beard. "Very interesting. Only responds to the boy, protects the boy, but stays calm as long as the boy stays calm." He pulled a leather wallet from his coat. "I'll give you $300 for the pair. That's generous, considering the animal's temperament. $300. Samuel had no real concept of money, but he understood that the figure represented more than his individual worth, more than Goliath's worth as beef or breeding stock. It represented them as a unit, as an attraction, as something that could be toured through county fairs and traveling shows, gawked at and poked and used up until they were no longer profitable. Whitford considered the offer, his fingers drumming against the fence rail. Samuel could almost see the calculations running through the man's mind, weighing immediate profit against potential future trouble, against the peculiar situation he'd found himself in, where a crippled boy and a dangerous bull had somehow upset the entire balance of his operation. Before Whitford could answer, a new voice cut through the afternoon air. "That bull's not for sale." Everyone turned. Martha Whitford stood 20 feet away, her traveling bag still in her hand as if she'd just arrived. Thomas Whitford's wife, former wife technically, though the divorce had never been finalized, looked older than Samuel remembered, but her eyes were sharp as cut glass. She'd been gone for 3 years, and no one had expected her to return. "Martha," Whitford said, and for the first time Samuel heard uncertainty in the man's voice. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," she said flatly. "Or did you forget that small detail in your hurry to sell off every living thing on this property?" She walked closer, her skirts raising small puffs of dust. "I heard about the boy and the bull, heard about it all the way in Georgia. You know what that means. It means you've created something notable, something people talk about, and you're going to sell it for $300 to a snake oil showman." Jessup bristled. "Now, see here. I see perfectly well, Mr. Jessup. I see a man trying to profit off something he doesn't understand and can't replicate." She turned to her husband. "And I see a man who's lost his sense entirely. That boy is worth more here on this plantation than he'd ever be in some traveling spectacle. You know why? Because every person working these fields believes he's special, believes he's protected, and as long as they believe that, they work harder, cause less trouble, and cost you less in discipline. You sell him, you lose that." It was a cold calculation, a mercenary logic that reduced Samuel's value to his usefulness in maintaining order. But it was also true, and Whitford knew it. Samuel could see the man's face shifting, reassessing, coming to the same conclusions his wife had already reached. "Besides," Martha continued, "I'm back now, which means I have a say in operations again. And I say the boy stays, the bull stays, and Mr. Jessup can take his $300 back to whatever hole he crawled out of." Jessup's face darkened. "You're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be my first," Martha said with a smile that had teeth in it. "Good day, Mr. Jessup." The dealer looked at Whitford, waiting for the man to overrule his wife, to assert his authority and complete the sale. But Thomas Whitford had gone still and quiet, and after a long moment, he gave a single curt nod toward Jessup. Dismissed, Jessup left with the kind of anger that promised future trouble. But for now, for this moment, he left. The crisis had passed. Samuel felt his legs go weak, felt himself sag against Goliath's solid warmth. The bull rumbled softly, a sound of comfort or maybe concern. Martha approached the pen slowly, carefully, her eyes on the bull rather than the boy. "So you're the one causing all this fuss," she said to Goliath. Then to Samuel, "What's your name, child?" "Samuel, ma'am." "Well, Samuel, it seems you and I are going to need to have a conversation about responsibility and expectations." She glanced at her husband. "Thomas, get back to the house. We need to discuss business. Samuel, you stay with that bull, keep him calm, and we'll talk later about what happens next." She walked away, Whitford trailing behind her like a man who'd just realized he'd lost a battle he hadn't known he was fighting. With a wave of his hand, Polk dispersed the gathered workers, sending everyone back to their tasks. Within minutes, the pen was surrounded only by silence and settling dust. Samuel stood there with his hand on Goliath's neck, processing what had just happened. He'd been sold and unsold in the span of 10 minutes. His future had been decided by people arguing over his monetary value like he was a piece of furniture. And yet, impossibly, he was still here, still standing, still breathing. Goliath shifted his weight, pressing gently against Samuel's side. The bull's warmth seeped through the boy's thin shirt, steady and reassuring. Whatever came next, whatever new complications Martha Whitford's return would bring, they'd face it together. That was something. In a world where so little could be counted on, where safety was temporary and dignity a luxury no one could afford, having this one constant presence felt like a miracle Samuel didn't deserve but desperately needed. As the sun dropped lower and the shadows grew long, Samuel finally left the pen and returned to the barn. But he could feel Goliath watching him go, those dark eyes tracking his movement across the yard. And he knew with absolute certainty that if he called out, if he needed help, if something threatened him, that bull would find a way to reach him, no matter how many fences stood in the way. That night, unable to sleep through the ache of his healing wounds, Samuel lay in the straw and counted his blessings in the only way he knew how. Not dead. Not sold, not alone. 3 small mercies that added together felt almost like hope. Like a stone dropped in still water, Martha Whitford's return changed the plantation, the ripples spreading outward in ways nobody could have predicted. She wasn't kind, Samuel learned that within the first week, but she was practical in a way her husband had never been. And practicality, it turned out, could sometimes look like mercy, even when it wasn't. She called Samuel to the house 5 days after the incident with Jessup. He climbed the porch steps with his heart hammering, still not used to being summoned without the promise of punishment, still expecting the other shoe to drop. Martha sat in the same rocking chair her husband had occupied, but where Whitford had sprawled with bourbon-soaked entitlement, she sat upright, a ledger open on her lap and a pencil tucked behind her ear. "Sit," she said, pointing to the porch steps. Samuel sat, keeping his eyes down the way he'd been taught. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." He looked up, startled. Her face was weathered but not cruel, lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying weight nobody else could see. "I've been going through the books," Martha said without preamble. "This plantation is drowning in debt. My husband's been drinking more than he's been managing, and the yields have dropped 30% in 3 years. You understand what that means?" Samuel shook his head. "It means we're maybe 2 bad seasons away from losing everything, the land, the house, all of it." She closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "Now, I don't particularly care about your feelings, boy, but I care about efficiency and I care about survival. And what I've observed is that since you and that bull started your little arrangement, productivity has actually increased. People work harder, they cause less trouble, they even sing while they pick, which they haven't done in years." She leaned forward. "You want to know why?" "No, ma'am. I mean, yes, ma'am. I mean because they have hope," Martha said, cutting through his stammering. "False hope, probably. Meaningless hope, certainly. But hope nonetheless. And hope, as it turns out, is cheaper than a whip and more effective." She pulled the pencil from behind her ear and pointed it at him like a weapon. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep doing whatever it is you do with that bull. You're going to be visible. You're going to let people see that you're protected, that something larger than human cruelty is watching out for the weak. And in return, I'm going to make sure you're fed properly, that you have decent clothes, and that nobody touches you without my express permission." Samuel tried to process what she was saying. Sounded like protection, but it felt like a transaction. She was using him, using the story of him and Goliath to maintain control. It was cynical and calculating, and probably the closest thing to kindness he was ever going to receive from someone with her kind of power. "One more thing," Martha said, her voice dropping. "My husband is a weak man who covers his weakness with cruelty. He's going to try to reassert himself, probably sooner rather than later. When he does, you stay close to that bull. You understand? Don't give him any opportunity to catch you alone." "Yes, ma'am. Good. Now get back to work." Samuel stood and limped down the stairs, his mind spinning. As he crossed the yard, he saw Whitford watching from an upper window of the house, a glass in his hand, even though it was barely past noon. The man's face was shadowed, unreadable, but Samuel felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. Martha's warning echoed in his head. He's going to try to reassert himself. The attempt came 3 weeks later on a Sunday morning, when most of the enslaved workers had been given a few hours of rest. Samuel had gone to the pen early, bringing Goliath some apples he'd managed to save from the kitchen scraps. The bull greeted him with that familiar rumble, lowering his head for Samuel to scratch between his horns. They stood like that for a while, boy and animal, in the kind of comfortable silence that didn't need words. Samuel didn't hear Whitford approach until it was too late. The man had been drinking. Samuel could smell it from 10 feet away, that sour sweet of bourbon and rage. Whitford carried a rifle loosely in one hand, not quite pointing it, but not quite not pointing it either. His eyes were red, rimmed and unfocused, but his voice was steady enough when he spoke. "Been thinking," Whitford said, his words slightly slurred. "My wife thinks you're valuable. Thinks that bull of yours is keeping people in line, but I think she's wrong. I think you're a disease, boy. A cancer growing in the middle of my property, making people forget their place." Samuel's hand tightened on Goliath's neck. The bull had gone still, his attention fixed on Whitford with an intensity that made the air feel electric. "So I got a solution," Whitford continued. "Simple one. I shoot the bull, you lose your protection, and everyone remembers real quick what happens when you try to rise above your station." He raised the rifle, not quite aiming yet, but the intention clear. "You can't," Samuel said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Your wife said." "My wife doesn't own this land." "I do, and I say what happens on it." Whitford's finger moved toward the trigger. "Step away from the animal, boy. Unless you want to catch a bullet, too." Samuel didn't move, couldn't move. Every muscle in his body had locked tight, frozen between terror and something deeper. Something that felt like rage or grief, or both twisted together. If Goliath died, the hope Martha had talked about would die too, and maybe hope was false and meaningless like she'd said, but it was also the only thing that made life on this plantation bearable for the people who'd started to believe in it. Goliath moved first. The bull stepped forward, positioning himself between Samuel and the rifle, his massive body a wall of muscle and defiance, his head lowered, horns pointing forward, hooves planted in the dirt like he was rooting himself to the earth. The message was clear: "You'll have to go through me." "Stupid animal," Whitford muttered, but his hands had started shaking, whether from alcohol or fear, Samuel couldn't tell. "Should have done this months ago." The shot, when it came, didn't come from Whitford's rifle. It came from behind him, from Martha Whitford, standing 30 feet away with a shotgun braced against her shoulder. The blast tore into the ground 2 feet from her husband's boots. Close enough to spray him with dirt, close enough to make him stumble backward with a shout of alarm. "Drop it, Thomas," Martha said, her voice flat and cold as January ice. "Drop the rifle and step away from the pen." "You crazy," I said. "Drop it." She pumped the shotgun, loading another shell into the chamber. "I will shoot you, Thomas." "Don't think I won't. You're worth more to me dead and insured than alive and drunk." The moment stretched, brittle and dangerous. Then Whitford's rifle clattered to the ground, and he raised his hands in a gesture that was half surrender, half supplication. "This is my land," he said, but the words came out weak, desperate. "Mine. It's the bank's land," Martha corrected. "We're 3 months behind on payments. And the only reason we're not foreclosed is because I've been managing the books and begging for extensions. You lost the right to make decisions when you started drinking away our future." She jerked the shotgun toward the house. "Get inside. Sober up." And if I catch you near that boy or that bull again, I'll put you in the ground myself." Whitford looked at Samuel, looked at Goliath, looked at his wife with her steady hands and steadier resolve. Whatever he saw, there broke something in him. His shoulders sagged, his face crumpled, and he walked toward the house like a man going to his execution, leaving the rifle lying in the dirt. Martha waited until he was inside before lowering the shotgun. She didn't look at Samuel, didn't acknowledge what had just happened. She just picked up her husband's rifle, checked that the safety was on, and walked away without a word, leaving Samuel standing there shaking so hard his teeth chattered. Goliath turned and pressed his head against the boy's chest. That warm, solid weight, the only thing keeping Samuel upright. He wrapped his arms around the bull's neck and let himself cry for the fear, for the close call, for the impossible weight of being 10 years old and having people's hope resting on his skinny shoulders. After that day, something shifted in the plantation's dynamics. Whitford stopped appearing in public, took his meals alone, spent his days in the study with curtains drawn. Martha ran everything now, and she ran it with an iron efficiency that increased yields and decreased violence in equal measure. She was never kind, but she was consistent, and consistency was its own kind of mercy. The enslaved workers noticed. They noticed Whitford's absence, noticed Martha's authority, noticed that Samuel walked the grounds unmolested while Goliath watched from his pen like a guardian spirit. The story grew with each telling how the bull had defied a loaded rifle, how Martha had chosen the boy over her husband, how something larger than human cruelty was at work on the Whitford plantation. It wasn't true, not really. Samuel knew the truth was messier, more complicated, built on calculations and convenience rather than justice or divine intervention, but he also knew that truth mattered less than belief, and people needed to believe that resistance was possible, even in its strangest forms. Winter came, cold and hard. The cotton was picked and baled and sold, bringing in just enough to keep the bank at bay for another season. Christmas passed with a small celebration. Martha allowed extra rations and a day of rest, a pragmatic gesture that cost her little but bought considerable goodwill. Samuel received his first real gift, a pair of boots that actually fit, sturdy enough to support his bad foot properly. They came with no note, no acknowledgement, but he knew they were from Martha, knew they were part of the transaction they'd entered into that day on the porch. He wore them to the pen every morning, walking through frost-hard ground to bring Goliath his breakfast. The bull had grown a thicker coat for winter. His gray hide darkened to almost charcoal in the weak sunlight. They'd been together nearly a year now. Boy and bull, and Samuel couldn't remember what life had been like before. Couldn't remember being completely alone. Couldn't remember not having this one relationship that asked nothing of him except presence and kindness. Spring brought new complications. A fever swept through the plantation in March, dropping half the workforce into shivering, delirious misery. Essie died on the fourth day, her grandson holding her hand as she slipped away. Big Marcus's daughter caught it next, and then the old man Joseph, and then a dozen others whose names Samuel had only just learned. Martha brought in a doctor from Montgomery, paid him with money she couldn't afford to spend, but medicine in 1899 could only do so much against infections they didn't understand and couldn't treat. Samuel caught it on the 10th day. The fever came on fast, turning the world into a swirling nightmare of heat and cold, of voices that weren't there and visions that made no sense. He collapsed in the barn, too weak to make it back to his straw bed, too disoriented to call for help. He might have died there alone in the dark if Goliath hadn't started bellowing. The bull's voice carried across the plantation like an alarm, deep and urgent and impossible to ignore. He threw himself against the fence of his pen over and over until the boards began to splinter. Poke heard it first, came running with his pistol drawn, thinking the animal had finally gone mad. Instead, he found Goliath trying to break free, his eyes fixed on the barn, his whole body straining towards something Poke couldn't see. Martha came next, and she was smart enough to understand. "The boy," she said, and sent Poke running to check the barn. They found Samuel burning with fever, his lips cracked and bleeding, his body convulsing. Martha herself helped carry him to one of the cabins, assigned 2 women to tend him, and made sure he got the same medicine as everyone else, not kindness. Practicality. He was valuable to her operation, and valuable things got preserved. But even in his delirium, even when the fever had him so far gone that he couldn't remember his own name, Samuel could hear Goliath. The bull's voice carried through the walls, through the fever dreams, a constant reminder that someone was waiting, that someone would notice if he disappeared. It was enough. On the 7th day, the fever broke. On the 8th, he could sit up. On the 9th, he limped to the pen on shaky legs and pressed his forehead against Goliath's neck, feeling that steady heartbeat beneath his skin, and cried with relief. "You called for me," Samuel whispered. "You made them find me." Goliath rumbled softly, his breath warm against Samuel's hair. The fever took 18 people. Before it burned itself out, they buried them in the plot beyond the cotton fields, 18 new graves in a row marked with wooden crosses that would rot within a decade. Samuel attended every funeral, standing at the back while the preacher, another enslaved man who learned scripture from a Baptist missionary years ago, spoke words about rest and peace and a better place beyond the valley of tears. Samuel wasn't sure he believed in a better place, but he understood the need to believe in something. Summer came heavy and brutal, the heat pressing down like a hand on the back of the neck. The cotton grew thick and demanding, requiring constant attention. Samuel worked where he could, doing what his body allowed, but his bad foot had gotten worse after the fever, the limp more pronounced. Martha reassigned him to full-time animal care, a position that kept him close to Goliath and visible to the workers, which served her purposes perfectly. It was during that summer that the Reverend came. His name was Josiah Freeman, and he was one of the new breed of black preachers who'd emerged after Reconstruction men who could read and write and knew how to navigate the dangerous waters between servitude and freedom. He traveled from plantation to plantation with permission from the owners, conducting services and baptisms, bringing news from the outside world. Martha allowed him onto the property because it cost her nothing and kept the workers pacified. Reverend Freeman held service under the big oak tree on Sunday afternoon, July 16th, 1899. Nearly 40 people gathered, sitting on the ground or standing in the shade, and Samuel sat among them with Goliath positioned nearby, the bull content to doze in the heat while the humans sang and prayed. Reverend's voice was rich and powerful, carrying across the yard with a certainty that made people lean in, made them listen. He preached about Daniel in the lion's den, about how faith could close the mouths of beasts, about how God protected the righteous from harm. And as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to Samuel and Goliath, drawn by the story he'd heard, the impossible friendship that defied natural law. After the service, Reverend Freeman approached Samuel directly, crouching down so they were eye level. "I hear you got a special friend," he said, nodding toward Goliath. "Yes, sir, you know what I think." The Reverend's eyes were kind but serious. "I think you've been given a gift. Not just the bull's protection, that's remarkable, surely, but the gift of showing people that love matters, that kindness matters, that even in a place designed to break spirits, connection is possible." He placed a hand on Samuel's thin shoulder. "That's holy work, son. Don't ever think it isn't." Samuel didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of what he did as holy, never considered that his friendship with Goliath might mean something beyond survival. But the Reverend's words settled into him like seeds, and over the following weeks they began to grow into something that felt like purpose. August brought a crisis nobody saw coming. A wealthy plantation owner from Texas named Clayton Merrick arrived with an entourage, ostensibly to discuss cotton prices with the regional growers. But his real interest became clear when he visited Whitford Plantation and asked to see the boy and the bull he'd heard so much about. Martha, desperate to make connections that might help with their debt, agreed to the demonstration. Merrick was everything Whitford wanted to be: rich, powerful, respected, and ruthless in a way that didn't require alcohol to fuel it. He watched Samuel and Goliath interact with the calculating gaze of a man who saw opportunities where others saw oddities. After 10 minutes, he made Martha an offer: $500 for Samuel, $700 for the bull, $1,200 for the pair. It was more money than the plantation would earn in half a year. Martha's face went pale as she calculated what that sum could do. The debts it could pay, the breathing room it could buy, the disaster it could forestall. Samuel saw her hesitate, saw the numbers running through her head, and felt the ground drop out from under him. "Mrs. Whitford," Merrick said smoothly, "I understand your reluctance, but consider I would treat them well. They'd be fed, clothed, cared for as valuable assets. I have plans to tour them through the South, perhaps even to New York for exhibition." The boy would see more of the world than he ever would picking cotton in Alabama. It was a gilded cage dressed up as opportunity, and Samuel knew with cold certainty that if Martha accepted, he would spend the rest of his life as a curiosity, a spectacle, paraded before audiences who would gawk and point and never see him as human. Goliath would be reduced to a performing animal, their friendship turned into theater, their connection commodified and sold by the hour. "No," Martha said. The word was quiet but final. Merrick's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon." I said no. Martha stood straighter, her jaw set. "They're not for sale, Mrs. Whitford. Perhaps you don't understand the enormity of what I'm offering." "I understand perfectly." Martha's voice had steel in it now. "What I don't think you understand is that some things are worth more than their immediate price. That boy and that bull keep this plantation running smoothly. They're worth more to me here than your $1,200 could ever be." It wasn't true, not exactly. $1,200 was a fortune, but it was also true in ways that Martha probably didn't fully understand herself, because what Samuel and Goliath represented: hope, resistance, the possibility of connection in a system designed to prevent it, couldn't be measured in dollars, and losing them would cost more than money could quantify. Merrick tried for another 10 minutes, increasing his offer to $1,500, then $2,000. But Martha held firm, and eventually the Texan left with a curt goodbye and a look that promised he wouldn't forget this refusal. After he was gone, Martha turned to Samuel with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Don't make me regret this," she said. Then she walked away, leaving Samuel standing there with Goliath, both of them still together, still free in the only way that mattered. That night, lying in his straw bed with barn cats curled around him for warmth, Samuel thought about what Reverend Freeman had said, holy work, and about all the people who'd approached him over the past year, seeking protection or hope, just the comfort of knowing that impossible things sometimes happened. He thought about Essie's grandson, who still came to stand by the pen, sometimes talking to Goliath about his grandmother. He thought about Marcus's daughter, safe now because Poke had learned to fear what the bull represented. And he realized that what he and Goliath had created accidentally, awkwardly, through nothing more than consistent kindness was a kind of testimony, not to divine intervention or supernatural power, but to something simpler and more profound, that love could exist even in hell, that connection could survive even the most brutal attempts to prevent it, that treating another living thing with gentleness could change the world in small but undeniable ways. Autumn came, and with it, the anniversary of Samuel's first encounter with Goliath in the pen. 1 full year of friendship, of protection, of growing into something neither of them could have imagined. The bull was fully mature now, massive and powerful, his horns swept back like crescent moons, his presence on the plantation as much a fixture as the big house or the cotton press. And Samuel, though still small for his age, though still limping, had grown in ways that had nothing to do with height or strength. He carried himself differently now, with an acquired confidence that came from being needed, from mattering. Martha called him to the porch one October afternoon, and this time he climbed the stairs without fear. She was going through ledgers as always, her pencil making scratching sounds against paper. When she looked up, there was something different in her face, not quite kindness, but maybe respect, maybe recognition. "You've kept your end of the bargain," she said without preamble. "Productivity is up, problems are down, and people work without constant supervision. You and that animal have made my job significantly easier." "Yes, ma'am, so I'm making a change." She pulled out a piece of paper, official, looking with stamps and seals. "This is a certificate of manumission. It legally frees you from bondage. You're still required to work the plantation. I'm not running a charity, but you'll be paid a wage. Small, but something. And when you turn 18, you'll be free to leave if you choose." Samuel stared at the paper, unable to process what he was seeing. Freedom, real freedom, legal freedom, the kind that couldn't be revoked on a whim. It felt impossible, like something from one of the stories Reverend Freeman told about Moses and the Promised Land. "Why?" The word came out as a whisper. Martha set down her pencil and looked at him directly. "Because you're more valuable to me free than enslaved. Free, you stay because you choose to. Free, your influence with the workers is based on respect rather than shared bondage. Free, you're a symbol of something better being possible. She picked up the pencil again, returning to her ledgers. Also, I'm tired, Samuel. I'm tired of being the kind of person who owns other people. This doesn't absolve me of anything, I know that. But maybe it's a start. She waved her hand, dismissing him. Take the paper to Reverend Freeman next time he comes through. He'll witness it and file it with the county. Samuel took the certificate with shaking hands, this piece of paper that weighed nothing and everything at the same time. He walked back to the barn, a dazed Goliath following him with those watchful eyes, sensing the change even if he couldn't understand it. When they reached the pen, Samuel climbed inside and sat down in the dirt, and Goliath lowered himself beside the boy, his bulk providing warmth and shelter. I'm free, Samuel said to the bull. At least I will be when it's official, free. Goliath rumbled softly, his eyes half closed, content in the moment. But I ain't leaving, Samuel continued, his hand buried in the rough hide. Not yet anyway. Not while you're here. Not while people still need what we got. He leaned his head against the bull's shoulder. Besides, where would I go? This is all I know. It was true and it was heartbreaking. The reality that freedom without options was just another kind of cage, but it was also more than he'd had yesterday, more than most people in his situation would ever have. It was possibility. It was potential. It was a door that had been locked suddenly standing ajar. The seasons turned 1 year into the next. Samuel remained on plantation, collecting his small wage, slowly saving money in a tin can he kept hidden in the barn. Goliath remained in his pen, growing older if not gentler, still protective, still willing to position himself between Samuel and any perceived threat. They were constants in a world that was slowly, painfully beginning to change. New laws came down from the federal government, most ignored in Alabama but acknowledged in other places. New movements began to stir, people organizing and resisting and demanding rights that had been denied. It would be decades before real change came. Samuel would be an old man before the civil rights movement reached its crescendo, but the seeds were being planted in these years, in small acts of defiance and connection and refusal to accept unacceptable. And in the meantime, on a struggling cotton plantation outside Montgomery, a young man and a bull continued their unlikely friendship, their daily routine of shared presence and mutual protection. People still came to watch, still drew strength from the sight, still believed that if a crippled boy could find safety with a dangerous animal, then maybe, just maybe, other impossible things were possible too. On a spring morning in 1903, Samuel walked to Goliath's pen as he had every morning for 5 years. He was 15 now, nearly as tall as he'd ever be, his bad foot still dragging, but his shoulders broader, his hands roughened by work. He carried an apple, still Goliath's favorite, and climbed into the pen with the ease of long practice. The bull was lying down, which was unusual. Goliath typically greeted him standing, head raised, ready for the day. But this morning the animal remained prone, his breathing labored, his eyes clouded with something that looked like apology. Samuel knew immediately. He'd seen enough death on the plantation to recognize its approach. He knelt beside Goliath and placed his hand on that massive neck, feeling the heartbeat beneath, slower than it should be, irregular. "Hey there, friend," Samuel said softly. "Hey there." Goliath's eyes swiveled toward him, focused with effort. The bull's breathing steadied. Hitched again. Samuel stayed there, his hand never leaving that warm hide, talking the way he had since the beginning, about nothing and everything, about the weather and the work and the world beyond the fence, talking so Goliath wouldn't be alone. The bull died as the sun reached its zenith, a long exhale that didn't find a corresponding inhale. Samuel felt the heartbeat stop, felt the immense body go still beneath his hand. He sat there for a long time afterward, too numb for tears, feeling like some essential part of himself had stopped beating too. They buried Goliath in the field, beyond the cotton, where the earth was softer. It took 6 men and a pulley system to move him, and even then it was nearly impossible. Martha paid for a stone marker, simple granite, with just the name and years, Goliath, 1897-1903. Samuel stood by the grave after everyone else had left, and only then did he let himself cry great, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. But something strange happened in the weeks that followed. The protection didn't disappear with Goliath's death. It transformed. People still came to Samuel, still saw him as someone marked by something larger than himself. The story of the boy and the bull had become legend, and legends didn't die when the participants did. They lived on, growing and changing, becoming whatever people needed them to be. Samuel stayed on the plantation for 3 more years, fulfilling his obligation and saving money. On his 18th birthday, he packed his few possessions into a canvas bag, said goodbye to Martha Whitford, and walked away from the only home he'd ever known. He headed north, where Reverend Freeman had told him there were opportunities for young black men willing to work hard and dream bigger. But before he left, he visited Goliath's grave one final time. The grass had grown over it now, wildflowers blooming in strange abundance. Samuel knelt and placed his hand on the stone, feeling sun, warmed granite beneath his palm instead of warm hide, but the gesture the same. "Thank you," he said simply, "for standing when nobody else would. For showing me what love looked like. For being my friend." The wind moved through the cotton fields, carrying the smell of earth and growth and endless possibility. And Samuel stood, shouldered his bag, and walked toward a future that Goliath had helped make possible, not through protection alone, but through the lesson that consistent kindness, given freely and without expectation, could change the world one unlikely friendship at a time. Behind him, the stone marker gleamed in the Alabama sun, a testament to a bull that had been more than an animal, and a boy who had been more than his circumstances. And though neither of them lived to see it, the story continued, passed down through generations, a reminder that even in the darkest places, connection was possible. Resistance took many forms, and love, in whatever shape it came, was always worth the risk.